What's up, y'all? Welcome into another edition of DNVR Rams Live, presented by our friends at Branded Bills. Head to brandedbills.com. Use that code BBDNVR for 15% off of your first order. Hope everybody had a nice weekend. Hope everybody has had a great start to their week. Got a lot to dive into. It'll be kind of a random episode. We will talk about a disappointing showing, I would say, from CSU men's basketball up in Laramie on Saturday night. Suffered the worst loss to the Cowboys in a decade, so that's something. I will talk about the performance in that game. We'll talk about the team a little bit in a big picture sense. Not going to focus too much on that. It's just unfortunately been one of those years. The team has certainly underperformed, but it's been disappointing to see the way that they've been playing of late. We'll see if they can turn it around here in what should be a more favorable second half of the league slate. But I'm also not going to hold my breath at this point. You kind of know who this team is at this stage of the season. We're going to talk Klint Kubiak. We're going to talk about CSU football and some of the kind of big picture questions we have about the program, both under Jim Mora and just going into the Pac-12 era. We've talked a lot about this being a leap of faith, a gamble on oneself for all of these teams that are leaving the Mountain West, or Texas State leaving the Sun Belt, I guess, technically. But I just kind of wanted to talk about some of the big picture things we have to learn about this team in 2026 and beyond. We're going to talk Klint Kubiak a little bit here at the beginning. I'm excited. You know, we've got a pretty fun show for you. Shout out to everybody in the Toyota chat. If you wouldn't mind hitting a thumbs up if you're watching live on YouTube, I certainly would appreciate it. Helps the metrics and all of that. Looking forward to tonight, going to be at the Avs Red Wings takeover. The takeover events for DNVR are a blast if you are a Denver sports fan and you've never been to one of our Avs or Nuggets takeovers, even the Rockies, as bad as they are. It's always fun to be surrounded by community. I'm certainly looking forward to leaning into some of that vintage sports hatred. You know, I joked on Twitter the other day, the Avs Red Wings rivalry has been dead for well over a decade at this point, since Detroit moved to the East. But I still have that hate in my heart. I still feel it deep down inside. It's never going to dissipate. Same thing with, Wyoming, CU, the Raiders, all of that kind of stuff. It just sticks with you. And I've had a lot of sports hatred to lean into in recent days between the Avs Red Wings and the Border War Hoops Edition and even the Nuggets and Thunder. I cannot stand watching OKC. Great team. Certainly have a lot of respect for them, but I just visually can't stand watching Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. It kind of reminds me of the Harden era in Houston, where you can appreciate what they're doing without enjoying a second of it. And that's kind of where I'm at with that team. I just find them really annoying, feel like they get to beat the hell out of everyone they play. It's like they're playing a different sport. But the Nuggets got to be a whole lot tougher when they go against a team like that. I'm not going to lie, I've mentioned it a couple of times, but obviously it's been a big focus in the college basketball world of late. I am happy to see that Alabama's been struggling since they added the G League center. I just feel like it's bad for the sport as a whole, and I don't want that to be the direction that the game is heading. And it just feels like we've swung so far in favor of player empowerment that we've lost all common sense altogether. And I'm always careful to broach these topics because you can very easily go full boomer and just sound a million years old. And I get that a lot about the game has changed, and some of that's for the good, because if we're being real, the whole guise of being a student athlete to an extent was always used as a narrative to kind of exploit some of these guys, especially some of the big market value individuals. I've always pointed out that this whole conversation gets a little complicated because the amount of athletes that are actually brandable and could make big money, it's a pretty slim conversation. And the vast majority of these dudes aren't going pro. Obviously, they're going to end up working at Enterprise Rent-A-Car or wherever they may end up in their futures. But I just wonder, how far do we have to go before we can bring a little bit of common sense back into the fold? Because I am pro transfer portal. I am in favor of the players having some agency in all of this. I don't think you should have to stick around at the same school if it's just a bad fit. But I don't think it's good for the majority of these guys to be able to transfer multiple times without penalty. Maybe that's me being a boomer. I don't care. That's fine. You can label me that. I know what the reality for a lot of these student athletes is. And for the vast majority of them, it isn't going on to make millions in the NBA. It isn't going on to the NFL. And you're not graduating. You know, when you transfer 2-3 times the amount of credits these kids are walking away from, it's asinine. And on top of that, you're walking away from any alumni base that you might have, those relationships that then come back into play in your post-playing careers. You know, so-and-so gets you hooked up at Markley Motors, or, you know, hey, I've got this gig in Old Town, and you lose all of that. And there's a lot of value that comes in community. And I just think it's a shame to see that because the NCAA has become so toothless and spineless, that we're now in a position where it's just total anarchy, and it's not good for the players. It's certainly not good for the fans. Like, is this an enjoyable product for college football and college basketball fans? It's not. And again, like, that's not to say that you shouldn't have any ability to move in all this, but as much as people love to mock, you know, the Nick Sabans and Dabo Sweeneys of the world, he was pretty spot on in his most recent rants. And I do think that we need to figure out a healthy alternative. You know, you can transfer once without penalty, sure. Your coach gets fired or takes another gig, you can transfer again. But other than that, you know, outside of graduating with your degree, I just don't see how this has been good for the fans, good for the players, good for the sport. It's been a weird year for college sports, I would say. It's been fun in some sense. Like, the Indiana storyline was obviously really cool, and I do think that there's been an increase in parity in the portal era, and especially the NIL era these last couple years, because teams like Bama and Georgia and Clemson, you know, early in the CFP era, they're just going 4 lines of guys deep of 5 stars. I mean, the amount of talent that you were able to stockpile back in the day, you just can't do that because guys aren't going to sit around for 3 years if they're not playing. And I think that has led to some different schools, you know, playing a factor in all this, and that's good. But man, it's been just on the surface, kind of a shameful year for college sports, it feels like. I don't know. Thank you for giving me a couple of minutes to rant on that. I do have a bunch of other stuff to get into, though, so we'll move on. We'll talk about Klint Kubiak. You know, he got the Raiders gig. As a Broncos fan, don't love that. Feels a little bit weird to have a Kubiak on the sidelines, you know, in silver and black. That just, I don't know. It'd be like seeing Matt Lubick coach in Boulder or something like that, or Laramie. It just feels wrong for me as a diehard Broncos fan. But it is a big opportunity for Klint, and it obviously is good for the brand. I believe he is just the second former CSU football player in history to become an NFL head coach. He joins Jack Christensen, who's in the NFL Hall of Fame as a player, by the way. If you're a youngin', you aren't familiar with the Jack Christensen story, I highly recommend you do some research, get into him. I mean, he was Devin Hester in the 50s. They had to change kickoff rules because he was such an electric athlete back there. There've been a lot of position coaches, a lot of coordinators, obviously, over the years. Rick Dennison, you know, was Gary's right-hand man in Denver and Houston for all those years. But it's a big deal for a former CSU player to become an NFL head coach. And as great as Christensen was as a player and even a college coach, he was only 23, 38, and 3 as head coach of the 49ers between 63 and 67. So it wouldn't necessarily take like a crazy amount of success for Kubiak to go down as the most successful, you know, next level Ram to coach in the NFL, at least at the head coaching ranks. But it'll be interesting to see if he can make that a good gig again, because if we're being real, I didn't feel like the Raiders or the Cardinals job was all that desirable, aside from, you get Trey McBride in Arizona, but then you're saddled with a really bad Kyler Murray contract. Being fair to Kyler, I don't know if they're going to necessarily have any better options, at quarterback in 2026. We'll see what happens with all of that. I'm curious to see what LaFleur can do for Trey out in Phoenix. But, I mean, that's a tough gig to take over if you're Klint. I mean, you're going against what I would say is the deepest coaching division in football with Sean Payton, Jim Harbaugh, and Andy Reid. You're going against three of the top, I don't know, however you want to rank them, 10 to 12 quarterbacks in the NFL. I think Bo Nix, based on his success this past year, has an argument to be a top 10 quarterback. Maybe he's borderline. That's fair. But it's not an easy gig, and the perception of the Raiders is not what it once was for a reason, right? This isn't the days of the black hole. This isn't the Al Davis just win baby Raiders. I mean, this has been one of the worst teams in football for the vast majority of the last 2 decades. And I'll obviously be rooting for him. Again, it's very conflicting with him taking that Raiders gig as a lifelong CSU and Broncos supporter. Like, I can't exactly be cheering for the Raiders, but I obviously want Kubiak to have success. And I do think that it's desirable in the sense that, you're going to probably land Fernando Mendoza. What can you do at that quarterback? What is the Tom Brady element in all of this? How does that factor into this being a good gig or not? We shall see. But it does seem like he had his pick between the Raiders and the Cardinals and ultimately went with the Raiders. I'm very interested to see how this will play out in the end. Makes me feel really old. I'm not going to lie. I remember watching Klint play vividly, late elementary school for me, early middle school. I posted a highlight of that interception he had against Case Keenum in Houston in 2007. And it's funny, when you go back and you look at some of those schedules, you forget about some of the historically significant players you saw the Rams go up against. I mean, Case Keenum, statistically, one of the best producing quarterbacks of all time. Talent-wise, there've certainly been better quarterbacks. But I mean, he put up massive numbers. We saw Ben Roethlisberger, come to Hughes back in the day, Miami of Ohio. There were some deceptively big names that they went up against. But Kubiak was a great safety, maybe one of the more underrated players, just because it wasn't the most crazy successful time period for CSU football. The end of the Lubick era was obviously a bummer. You have a little bit of success early on with Fairchild, but then it simmers out pretty quickly. But 90 total tackles in 2006. Always felt like he balled out in the big games against CU. Just kind of felt like he was always around the ball. People think back to that big hit on Scotty McKnight. I think it was Elijah Bluesmith who delivered the bulk of it, but Klint was the other guy who was sandwiching him on that hit. He was a big-time gamer, and it's just cool to see him be in the NFL. And obviously, historically, Kubiak's being in a position of power in the NFL has meant good things for former CSU football players. I talked about this extensively when Dallin Holker ended up with Klint in New Orleans before he went on to Seattle this past year. I talked about it with Torrey Horton being drafted to Seattle this past season and why I felt like it was going to be a great opportunity for him, because when you look at, especially in the 21st century, there have been a lot of guys who probably wouldn't have gotten looks in the NFL had it not been for Kubiak, because these weren't typically the Trey McBrides of the world. Like, those guys are going to land with an NFL team no matter what. But I mean, the David Andersons of the world, Joel Dreesen getting a chance to revive his career after things didn't work out with the Jets, Shelley Smith in Houston. I mean, Bradley Van Pelt being on the Broncos roster and being the backup to Jake Plummer for a couple years was specifically because of Gary. Cecil being on the team was specifically because of Gary. And we've seen Klint, although in a small sample size, I mean, 2 straight years has taken the most prolific offensive CSU football player and had them, be able to translate at the next level. Now, Dallin ultimately retired. I think his age, and I don't want to speak for him. I mean, I just think he was ready to be a family man and stuff. But he ended up, choosing to walk away from the game. But I think he was in line to be pretty successful. And obviously Torrey, aside from the injury stuff, was putting up massive numbers, before he got hurt, and feels like he has a really bright future. So I think just aside from this being good from an association standpoint, every time they do the Sunday Night Football and they talk about the coaches' backgrounds, and then, they'll talk about him being Gary's son and being grown up around the Broncos and playing at CSU. Like, that's good for your brand, but also it's simply good for your brand to have guys that make it, to the next level that played for you. And the more Kubiaks that there are in the NFL, the better it's going to be for, CSU sending talent to the league, which is cool. And it's also cool that there's 4, former Mountain West players as head coaches in the league now. For all the dismissive, commentary you get about P4 versus Group of 6 and all of that. Kubes, Shane Steichen played at UNLV. Kevin O'Connell was a quarterback at San Diego State, and obviously Kellen Moore, who's now the head coach of the New Orleans Saints, although he only played 1 year in the Mountain West. All of these things are good for the brand. It's good for respect. Joey wants to know, was Klint Kubiak courted by CSU to be head coach? Just out of curiosity. Elated with the Mora hiring, but wondering who else was on the list. I don't know how seriously Klint was considered. I don't know if Klint had any actual real interest in coaching the collegiate ranks right now anyways, just because he was such a hot NFL name. I mean, I would assume and I would hope that the search committee at least did enough due diligence to reach out to Kubiak's people and float it out there. Hey, would you? I would imagine that at the very least happened. That happened with Becky Hammond back in the day. You put it out there knowing that realistically he's probably not going to be your guy just because he's going to have so many other options. But I don't actually know who the other finalists were. They did a pretty good job of keeping that info locked in. I mean, I'll certainly ask, about some of these guys. I doubt we'll ever find out just because you don't really benefit from that info being public if you're CSU, because, like, let's say Jason Candle, who I do think they took a pretty serious look at, who ended up being the UConn head coach after Mora, ironically, like, if he goes and kills it and Mora doesn't end up being who you want him to be, now you're in a position of playing the comparison game, and there's just not a lot to be gained by all of that. But from our standpoint, I'm certainly curious, and I'll do my best to see if I can get some clarity on, who the other more serious candidates were and all of that. We're going to get into some of the big picture questions we have about CSU football in the Mora era in just a second. Let me take a quick couple of minutes and shout out a couple of partners, and we'll keep the party rolling. All right, whether you need snapbacks, truckers, fitteds, beanies, or tees, the homies at Branded Bills have you covered. Rocking my Branded Bills hat right now. One of them, I should say. I've got 3 now, and what's cool is they've got a nice little variety. I've got a camo one. I've got the gold one here in the background on the set. Obviously rocking this black one. I wear it all the time. If you're looking for gear to make your own brand stand apart, look no further than Branded Bills. They've got you covered with the best custom headwear, obviously, but their dedicated team will help you get the exact custom apparel you need. And they make shirts and all kinds of other stuff as well. They've got a partnership with CSU as part of their on-campus collection. Feel like I've been seeing more and more Branded Bills hats on campus, which has been cool to see. A lot of the younger position coaches and assistants and stuff on the football team, they were rocking them this past year. I'm seeing more and more people in Moby wearing them. It's really cool. But if you want to save some money, head to brandedbills.com. Use that code BBDNVR for 15% off of your first order. I also want to talk to you about Toyota. Trucks have always been a part of Toyota's DNA for generations. Toyota's built durable legends destined for greatness and perfect for Colorado. Whether you're conquering off-road trails, whether you're hauling the weight of the world, there's a Toyota truck that's just right for you. Check out the Tacoma. Check out the Land Cruiser. You can't go wrong either way. Toyota has 17 models available all-wheel drive or four-wheel drive. That's what makes them so perfect for Colorado. I know it's been a fairly mild winter, although we'll see. Groundhog Day sounds like we're getting 6 more weeks of winter. Don't love that. But I do love knowing that if I'm ever in a position where, I need to get around town in the weather, I should just get in a Toyota. Toyota offers more low and zero emission vehicles combined than any other automaker to give customers numerous choices to reduce their carbon footprint. And they've got 16 hybrid vehicles to choose from, like the Tundra iForce Max hybrid truck. Toyota is a proud partner of CSU Athletics. They are the official vehicle of DNVR. Toyota, let's go places. Okay, cool. I did want to just briefly throw out, I had talked about on Friday's show just Pac-12 perception and the fact that the lack of clarity at the moment has made some of this feel slightly underwhelming. While I still support the decision, I completely understand where all these programs are coming from. You're trying to make the best of a bad spot. I don't know if I necessarily articulated exactly what I was trying to say, which is just that it feels like a lot is being kept close to the chest. And being fair to the Pac-12, that could very well just be strategic play. Let's decide on our own terms exactly what and when the information is going to come out. I think if you were playing devil's advocate, if you had this massive win or it was going to come off as a win from a perception standpoint, optically, I don't think you would be keeping it close to your chest. I don't think the media numbers are going to be like massive. We'll see. I mean, who knows in all of this. I recognize there are a ton of wrinkles, and I'm just a dude with a podcast. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not in these meetings. Again, I'm still very much on board with the move to the Pac-12. It just feels like it hasn't been as smooth of a rollout as one would have hoped for. And I do think that they maybe overplayed their hand a little bit with some of the American schools. Thought some of those schools would be a little bit more willing to take the gamble, with CSU and Boise and San Diego State. Because I think had they known it would play out that way, you probably would have just invited like UNLV or New Mexico or one of those schools in the first place. Maybe I'm wrong. Again, this is me just going based on the direction of the wind, not inside info. I'm not in those meetings, who knows? Maybe the athletic directors and the presidents, they all feel phenomenal about the way this is all going. We just don't know. But it does feel like if they got what would be considered a home run from a media deal, we'd have that info, right? Like if you had a great option for the schedule, it would already be out and about. I don't know. We'll see what happens with all that. But regardless, I am excited to see, how this Pac-12 brand is able to, I guess, attempt to rebuild itself, over the next, 5-6 years. I do try and add that every time we talk about this. It's not just a 2026 play. Most certainly, you want to see the league hit the ground running. You certainly want to see a Pac-12 team in the playoff. If you're getting passed over by, a Memphis or a UNLV, that's really going to hurt your argument that you are, the best of the rest, if you will. But I have a lot of questions about CSU moving forward because this is a big gamble. And if it doesn't work, if this hire doesn't hit, if this conference isn't a success, you have now spent a shit ton of money in the last, 15 plus years between the building of the stadium and all of this to essentially be right back in the same position you were in the first place, if not arguably a worse spot. Because I mean, there were times late in the Mountain West era or the initial Mountain West, where I think perception-wise the league was considered pretty good, especially when you go back to like the late stages of Utah and even TCU before they dipped. Obviously, like those were teams that were competing, in New Year's Six Bowls, Fiesta Bowls, and stuff like that. And again, if this doesn't work, I just don't really know where you go from here. But I think one of the things that's very interesting and exciting about the Pac-12 is that it all feels pretty open at the moment. It doesn't really feel like, outside of, I guess, Gonzaga on the basketball side, you don't really go into this thinking like one school is so significantly above the rest. It doesn't really feel like you have a ton of brands that should be really dragging you down either. Like it doesn't feel like it should be New Mexico, when they were going 2-10, or San Jose State with their depressing empty stadiums. Like from a community investment standpoint, from a general competitive standpoint, I feel like the league should be pretty fun. I do wonder if it's going to be, I wonder if the parity is going to be so even that it prevents you from having somebody who shines bright enough to like really branch out, and that could hurt you, like if you have a bunch of 8-4 teams, even like a couple of 9-3 teams, but Memphis goes 11-1 and wins the American, or UNLV runs the table in what's going to be a terrible league. Could that end up keeping you out of the playoff conversation? I guess we'll see. A lot of this still to be sorted out, but where will you stand in all of this? I think that's my first big picture question for CSU. In the early stages of the Mountain West, a conference that you helped form, you won the league 3 times in the first 4 years. You were one of the staple brands of the Mountain West. It's been a long time since that's been the case, though. I mean, you haven't even been to a conference championship game since 2002, let alone won one. And you've been lapped by a lot of your peers at this point. San Diego State, Utah State. Fresno State, I would say, has always been kind of sneaky, under the radar, competitive. You look back at even, the late 90s, early 2000s, they were a thorn in CSU's side. We lost a lot of tight games to Fresno back in the day. But the UNLVs of the world, getting lapped by them, like that would have seemed implausible, even in like 2010. If you would ask, 15-year-old Justin, if, 15 years from now, UNLV will have lapped CSU, I would have laughed. I'm like, are you crazy? But that's exactly what happened. And so you've got to get the ball rolling here, and you've got to get some positive momentum, and you've got to capitalize on the fact that there isn't going to be a Goliath in this conference. It's not going to be 2011 Boise State hanging 70 on everyone. Washington and Oregon State, they ain't what they used to be. I think there's a chance for a lot of these teams to be good, but nobody feels like they should be a team that is just absolutely terrifying to you, or like, we can't get over that hurdle. I mean, you should be right there in the mix with these programs. Can you actually do it, though? Because we've been arguing this for so long, what CSU could be, woulda, coulda, shoulda, because what the program and what the school offered, and how awesome of a community in a college town Fort Collins is. It's been a lot of hypothetical, though, over the last 20 years, and frankly, I'm tired of talking myself into, well, they could be a giant. Well, if you could be, then you should be. Go out and make it happen. Can you finally go out and become the type of program that we've been saying and theorizing and all of this for the better part of 2 decades? Can you actually be the program that you have invested to be? You've done the right things from a community investment standpoint. The fans have showed up. The attendance has been great. Your facilities are awesome. You just got to win. That's really what it comes down to. I mean, it's just been really disappointing to see how little that the Rams have done when it comes to, striking while the iron is hot post McElwain. Just, you had all that momentum. You got the stadium built. You had realistic aspirations of making the Big 12. It didn't end up playing out your way, but the fact that Central Florida and Cincinnati and schools like that got in, it shows that schools like CSU and San Diego State and Boise weren't insane for thinking that they had an opportunity. They just missed the boat that time around, and that's why we're in this Pac-12 position in the first place. Again, it's why I would argue, even though it is a gamble, and why teams like Memphis, why you could say, I don't know if this is the smartest thing to do, to risk hundreds of millions of dollars. I would also argue that staying complacent is a borderline guaranteed death sentence at this point. I mean, the AAC, now that it's been gutted through multiple rounds of realignment, is just completely irrelevant as far as, the national conversation goes. What is that going to do to their basketball brand, over a 10-year period? You can be the new hot thing, and that fizzles pretty quick. I mean, look at Wichita State and the momentum they had, 10 years ago, and how that's just completely fizzled out. Being in a bad league is a bad investment. And again, that's why I think a lot of these schools were willing to make that gamble. And it is a gamble. There are no guarantees that this is going to work out or that it's going to pay off the way that CSU hopes it will. But I do think that if you sit on your hands, you're bound to be condemned to a state of mediocrity at best. And that's what I would argue with Memphis. And that's why a lot of their supporters even are they feel that it's worth, putting your chips in the table and going for it, because we know that we don't love where we're at right now. And we know that's not going to change. So why not go for it? What else do you have to lose at this point, I guess, other than millions of dollars? But, it's all monopoly money at this point anyways. What even is money? The next big picture question I have is, what kind of home field advantage will CSU have in the Pac-12 era? Because they didn't have much of one at all at the end of the Mountain West era. I think that's probably been the biggest disappointment over the last 10 years, or, really going back to the opening of Canvas Stadium, is how consistently we've been in the media room and had to listen to the visiting locker room just going absolutely crazy. I've joked about it a couple of times, but the most poppin' place in Fort Collins on a Saturday night in football season, more times than not, it's been the opposing locker room, and that has to change if the Rams are going to be a top 25 program. Most certainly, those teams always take care of business at home. But if you're going to be a contender, if you are going to be any of the things that you want to be, you have to have so much more success at Fort Collins. That's how you create investment from your fans, by having those positive experiences of being there in the building for those electric moments, witnessing a big win in person. They just haven't had enough of that. And even the fun moments that they've had, they've largely been crazy comebacks where the majority of the fans had already, hit the exits. And that's just something that has to change. And you look at the last 5 seasons, even with Jay having some success, they were pretty good at home in 2024. And they're just 15-16 since the start of 2021. Over the last 5 years, just 15-16 at home. And that took a stretch of going like 7-1 at one point over an 8-game stretch to even get to that. Boise, on the other hand, at home since the start of 2021, they're 26-7. They've won multiple conference championships at home. And that's not even like a crazy dominant stretch for them. 26-7 for Boise is probably considered like slightly below average. I mean, they had stretches where they'd be going 34-1 over a 35-game stretch at home. Like, they were insanely dominant, and it's what in large part allowed them to become the brand that they were. They did not lose on the blue. They went out on the road and they hung. I remember watching back when they were like a top 10 team, watching them, go on the road and play teams like Virginia Tech and giving them, everything that they could handle. But they did not lose on the blue. And CSU, it just has not been much of a home field advantage. And until that changes, a lot of what we're arguing is going to be moot. Because if you can't win your home games, you sure as shit aren't going to be a top 25 team, and you aren't going to be a team that is able to compete for conference championships either. Got to steal a couple on the road as well. That's another conversation. The Rams just haven't won a lot of games, period. They haven't won a lot at home. They haven't won a lot on the road. They just need to win more, period. But can you win some of these big games that matter at home? Can you beat some of your rivals? You're 3-8 versus Wyoming in the last 11. It's not like Wyoming's exactly been dominant in that stretch. They're 2-9 against Air Force. Thank God you don't have to deal with them anymore. It's because it's just another rivalry game to make us feel bad about ourselves. 0-7 versus CU, 1-9 versus Boise. That's all, going back to 2015. That's insane. That's absolutely insane. And then how can you generate any type of real traction if you can't win the games that matter? That was Bobo's problem, right? Bobo wasn't a disaster. It wasn't a train wreck. But going 7-5 every year when you also lose the bowl game and you can't beat a single rival that matters, eventually that feels pretty lackluster. You can get away with that for a year, maybe 2. Once it becomes a sustained thing, that kind of becomes the identity of your program. And that's really been CSU in the big moments over the last, decade plus. This has been a program that crumbles under the lights, and I'd love to see it change. I mean, when was the last time the Rams capitalized on a truly big moment, like really seized it? There certainly wasn't the Arizona Bowl. I know they beat Wyoming and Air Force in the same season in 24, and that was kind of fun. But both those teams were terrible. Like, just being fair, they were the Boise comeback, I mean, I guess it was nice to get that monkey off of your shoulder, finally, you know, get a win over them on the record books, but that was the worst Boise team of the last 10 years. I really feel like you got to go back to that 2014 Utah State homecoming win, when the last time there was genuine stakes. You're trying to play your way into the top 25. You're trying to keep your conference championship hopes alive. And we saw a CSU team rise to the moment and seize it. Maybe the opening of Canvas Stadium, I guess, being fair. That 2017 Oregon State win was pretty fun. But both of those instances were still followed up by, you know, teams going peak Ram life and coming up short. You know, in 2014, you still pissed down your leg in the Air Force game, blow that opportunity. And then 2017, obviously, we don't even have to get into the Boise collapse and what happened against Josh Allen up in Laramie. Just once, you'd like to see the Rams capitalize on one of those moments. You're playing CU at home on CBS, and you lose by multiple scores. You have CU on the ropes in Boulder with an opportunity to probably get the biggest upset of the entire season after nobody gave you a chance. You're like 26-point underdogs or whatever it was. Having to listen to, you know, all of the crap that came from CU fans. And what do? You choke. You choke and you blow the moment. I'm tired of seeing the Rams come up short in those moments. And I think you're going to have a couple this year, you know, whether it's the board opening the season with the border war. That's a big opportunity to get some positive momentum, to get a rivalry win, to get a trophy, you know, in your stadium. The Pac-12 opener, you got BYU in town. Like, it would be nice to see CSU find a way to come up clutch in one of these big games, because frankly, that's the biggest difference, you know, between Sonny Lubick and basically everybody else. Is Sonny in those big moments, the Rams, they found a way to get it done, and really nobody else has. Will CSU be a school that players with legitimate NFL aspirations prioritize in the Pac-12 era? I would say that compared to most programs of similar size, schools like CSU and Boise have had a lot more success retaining some of their top talent. These last couple of years, it's started to trend a little bit the opposite, because just nobody's hanging on to guys these days. But I mean, for a long time there, when basically if you popped even a little bit at like a Wyoming, I mean, how many receivers have we seen walk out the door because they had a 500-yard season for them? Like, it just felt like CSU was able to hang on to some of those, the Mo Camaras of the world, Trey McBride, Torrey, some of those types of guys. Would they stick around in 2026? I don't know. That's a tough question. There's so much money being thrown around, but you've got to be a program that sends players to the NFL, because it's so big for recruiting. It's huge for your perception. And although we've had a decent amount of NFL players in the last decade plus, typically that is going to translate with a certain level of success. Specifically, I'd like to see CSU produce a quarterback. I'd like to see them start sending some offensive linemen to the league again, because I think when you look at both the periods of when CSU was most successful, when the brand was most relevant on a national level, you know, they were having quality quarterback play. They were sending offensive linemen to the league, and it's been a long time since that's been the case. BFN's like the closest they've had, and he was all hypothetical. You know, the tools, he had an NFL arm talent, but certainly didn't play the position like an NFL quarterback. And it's been a long time since we've seen a quarterback really play at a high level for a consistent amount of time at CSU. Like Colin Hill, had he not gotten hurt, that's probably the only real conversation you can have. But other than that, I mean, Garrett Grayson, guys, that was a long time ago. Talk about another thing that makes you feel old. I mean, that was over a decade ago at this point. It's been a long time, and that has to change if the Rams are going to be nationally relevant. CSU Rams Daily says, I graduated in 24, and it's hard for me to convince my buddies who live in Denver to go to games. Hard to blame them last year. Yeah, I mean, last year especially, who wants to deal with that annoyance on I-25? You know, it's got to be a better product if you're going to get people to buy in. I think locally, the students and all that, they've done a great job of showing up. But it's not just a 20-minute drive to the stadium from Denver. You know, you're looking at best an hour, and realistically more like an hour and a half to 2 hours, depending on the traffic. So if you want people to be willing to commit their entire day, and that's what it becomes, and it becomes an entire day commitment, you know, they've got to be a whole lot better. Until they do, it's going to be pretty tough to sell them. And it doesn't help that, you know, the tickets and canvas aren't exactly cheap. Like, am I going to spend $80 and commit 10 hours out of my day for a 5-hour college football game plus the round trip to watch CSU lose by double digits at home. Like, there are better things you could do with your weekend, just being real. Success is what will change all of that, but we've been saying that for a decade, so we'll see. You know, what type of presence will what type of local presence will the roster have? I think they're off to a really good start when it comes to mending fences and kind of trying to improve the relationships with some of those local coaches around the state. You'll still see some people that whine no matter what. Trainers especially give some of the most disingenuous commentary when it comes to local recruiting. Oh, you mean the guys who pay money to you, who you are supposed to get them to the next level, you know, you're arguing they should be in the collegiate ranks. You don't think there's a little bit of individual bias and all of that? Come on now. I just, it cracks me up. Some of these guys, you know, look at this Division II school or this RMAC program offered this 5'7" cornerback. You know, what is CSU doing? I don't know, trying to build a roster that'll compete in the FBS. You need a strong local presence. You got to land the right local guys, though. And this is something that I've talked about repeatedly. And I think they're doing a better job of going after some of those local guys. And you look at the 27 class specifically, you know, they've offered some kids that I think are potentially going to have some big options. And that's where you want to be. You know, I talked about like Mason Bonner in this past cycle. It can't be a position where they've got 15 P4 offers before a school like CSU is even in the mix. Like, you're never going to have an opportunity to land them if that's the case. But look at like a 6'6", 230-pound Ryan Pankey out of Montrose High School. I think plays both tight end and an edge. I'd put him on the defensive side of the ball. You know, he's got an offer from CSU. He's got an offer from Wyoming now. By the end of this football season, that dude's going to have some big time offers. But you got to be early on these kids that are going to translate. And that's going to be the big key. You know, it's not going to be signing 50 Colorado kids just for the sake of signing them, because that's called an RMAC roster. And even RMAC schools have to recruit in multiple states. That's what, I'm not even going to get into it or give the guy the attention he so desperately seeks. But there's a guy in the Colorado high school football world who's just been ranting against CSU these last couple of days and basically been like, yeah, it was great, it was all for show. And now he's upset that, you know, they're not on their hands and knees begging some of these Colorado kids to stay local. Like, you do your best to build the relationships. You're not going to land every single one of them. You want to sign the kids that are going to translate. Realistically, there's probably going to be like 20 kids a year that come out that are going to translate at the FBS level. And at least half of them are basically all but guaranteed to go P4. So realistically, it's like a pool of 10 to 15 kids that you're competing against, not just CU, but like every other school in the country. It just annoys me how disingenuous some of the commentary can be. But I do think that obviously when you look at the Lubick era, you got to be able to land some of these offensive linemen, you know, some of these guys that are going to translate. And you've hit on a few. You know, it's not like they've completely ignored Colorado. Jack Howell, Henry Blackburn, Chase Wilson. They've had a lot of significant players in their program from Colorado, even in a time where a lot of these people were claiming, oh, CSU doesn't recruit Colorado at all. Okay. Other than the fact that you look at the 2 deep week 1 and there's like 7 dudes from the state. They've always had a presence. Does feel like they're ramping it up a little bit. And ideally that'll allow you to land some of these kids that are really going to pop off and get major P4 offers, and maybe help you land a couple of the more borderline kids as well, especially from, you know, the Valor Christian type programs. And I think it's huge having the ties that, you know, Matt Mitchell does, and having his brother-in-law, you know, be the head coach. Like that is a big win. We'll see how it plays out. But what kind of local presence will you have? We shall see. How aggressive will you be as a program in the Jim Mora era? I was kind of curious. I went through some of their 4th down numbers at UConn the last couple of years. They weren't overtly aggressive, at least compared to a lot of these programs who have really leaned into that. It's not surprising, Jim Mora being football lifer, you know, his dad being an old school NFL coach. I could see him being maybe a little bit more resistant to some of the modern trends when it comes to some of this stuff. And honestly, I think we'll see some of it swing back the other way. I think the over aggressiveness hurt a lot of teams in the NFL playoffs. But UConn only went for it on 4th down 21 times this past season. That was in the bottom third of the FBS, so not crazy aggressive. They did convert, though, on almost 67% of them. So when they were going for it, they were highly successful. You like to see that. That was tied for the 16th best fourth down percentage in the country. Comparatively, CSU, they went for it 30 times, only converted 14 times, 46.7%. That's in the bottom third of the country. Those numbers hold up pretty. They hold up pretty much throughout the Mora era at UConn. They only went for it 16 times in 24, so really not aggressive at all. Some of that is being effective on third down. UConn was converting at almost 42%, 41.8% on third down in 2025. That's top 50 in the FBS. CSU, on the other hand, only converted on 32.9% on third down. That ranked in the 100s, so not great. All of those things are going to be interesting, but just what type of mentality do you have as a program? Are you we kick it, on 4th and 3 from the 20, or are we we're going for points? My guess is probably the latter. I also think that some of the over aggressiveness maybe hurt Norvell at times in these past couple of years. Like they were trying to be a more modern, aggressive approach that they maybe didn't necessarily have the right personnel for. But I do want to know, what that looks like next year, and just in general, like what type of team is CSU? Are they the type of team that takes the points? Or are they the type of team that rolls the dice? Some of that probably will depend again on what you're doing on third down, how you're holding up in the trenches. There's a lot of factors that go into that. It's not just as simple as we like to go for it on fourth down. Do you have the right guys to go for it on fourth down? But I do think that'll be interesting to see kind of what the temperament of the program is and how aggressive CSU is when it comes to those types of decisions. And then with a defensive-minded head coach, which you haven't had in a while, can you just change the tune defensively? It's been so long since CSU's had an above-average defense. They've had somewhat formidable stretches for small periods of time. I would say 24. There were stretches in league play under Banks where they were pretty solid. I would say as bad as they were in the Adazio era, there were stretches under Chuck Heater where they had some success. But I mean, you look at the numbers, the Rams ranked 112th in the FBS in scoring defense this past year. UConn wasn't stellar. They were 81st. So, I mean, they've got to be better too. But you look at like the total defense numbers going back to 2016, Rams ranked 69th in total defense in 2016. From there, 98th, 111th, surprisingly 52nd in 2019. I don't remember the Rams being that competent defensively, but I guess they were. Then 98th, 111th, 52nd. They were 34th in 2020. They only played 4 games, but 34th, pretty good. 63rd in 21, 42nd, 107th, 96th, 124th. I mean, just sneaking in the top 50 in total defense has been like a hope and a prayer for CSU. I don't think all of a sudden you're going to be giving up 8 points a game or anything like that. You're not going to be the steel curtain. You're not going to be the no-fly zone Broncos. But, like, can you just not be a liability for once? Because even during the times when CSU has had pretty good offensive play, it just feels like the defense has been the bane of everyone's existence now for really like 20 years. I mean, I only went back to 2016. There were a lot of stretches in the Fairchild days and even late Sonny where the defense was not, what we saw in the late 90s, early 2000s when the Rams were in their heyday, when they were competing for championships. They've got to be more successful on that side of the ball. Dustin says being overly aggressive really killed several games last season. I'm okay slowing it down a bit. I tend to agree with you. I think a lot of aggressiveness should stem from, one, your personnel, do you have the right guys, but two, the flow of the game. And I think that's one of the things that I have beef with analytics at times. I don't know how much they account for situational variance, like in a vacuum, yeah, that decision to go for it might be great, but you know what? That's not factoring in the wind or the fact that it's snowing sideways or the fact that our left tackle tweaked his ankle in practice this week and he's a step slower than he normally is. Like, I just think a lot of that comes down to a feel. And I think that's what makes good coaches special, right? Is they're able to feel those moments out and when it's appropriate to go and when it's not. But if I had to guess, we see a little bit more of an old school approach from an old school football, lifer in Jim Mora. But those are some of the big picture questions I have about CSU. Some of them are kind of general, but where do you stand in the Pac-12 pecking order? What type of home field advantage are you going to have? How aggressive are you going to be as a program? What's the foundation of your roster look like? What type of local presence does it have? Are you going to still be a doormat against rivals? Like, these are a lot of things that are going to dictate whether CSU lives up to what we are hoping they can be in the Pac-12, or whether it's going to be more of the same. And again, I just keep coming back to this idea of, can you seize the moment? You've got a huge game against Wyoming week 1. You've got excitement going into the Pac-12, regardless of whether it's a power conference or not. Change is always exciting. So if you come out and you make a bunch of noise and you make a run to the Pac-12 title game, this move's going to feel like a big win. If it's just more of the same, then it kind of becomes a tougher sell. So we've got a lot riding on this move to the Pac-12. We got a lot riding on Mora. I've called this the biggest hire in the history of CSU athletics. I just think with the way that college athletics are trending and with the gap being wider and wider from the haves and the have-nots, you either figure it out now and all of this investment that you've made in athletics ends up being worth it, or you get left behind and you sit here thinking, should we have spent all that money, on the stadium? And even that's somewhat loaded because Hughes needed millions of dollars in renovations if you were going to keep it. It wasn't as simple as, let's just keep rolling with this old stadium. Like, if you were going to spend $50 million to renovate Hughes, why not just build the new stadium anyways? And while I don't think that the game day experience or atmosphere has been what was envisioned, I think so much of that stems from the fact that the Rams just haven't won enough ball games. You win games, all of a sudden campus is going to feel electric because it's a great facility. The atmosphere being sterile stems from the team being mid, not from the facility itself being crappy or something like that. But you've got to be more stout in the trenches. I agree. IRF_12 in the Toyota chat says trenches have gotten pushed around for years on defense. At least the corners have been able to run better under Norvell than in years past. I do agree with you there. And I actually like the build of this secondary on paper going into this year. I thought they did a good job of retaining some key guys, and I like the corners they went out and signed in the portal. I was really high on Lamondre Joe, going into last year. He ended up having a really nice season. I agree, but the trenches, they've got to be more consistent there. I do think, being fair to CSU, the injuries played a pretty big factor. Last year, you lose your two best defensive linemen and Gabe Jones and Mukendi Wakalanji before week 3. You're going to feel that, having to play first and second year players, you're going to feel that. Hopefully you reap the rewards of that this year. But we've said that before, like you were supposed to reap the rewards of having suffered lumps of mediocre quarterback play, for a couple years before this past season. It didn't play out that way. There's no guarantees, but if you're looking for a silver lining, it's that some of those guys who kind of got baptized by fire this past year should be better prepared, going into this next season from the tough experiences that they had to go through this past season. We'll see. We'll see. A lot to be sorted out with this program, a lot to be found out, about the football team. They've got to find a way to strike while the iron is hot, which is something that I would say CSU has more or less failed to do for 2 straight decades. Before we get out of here, I am going to give some thoughts on basketball. I didn't want to talk hoops for 60 minutes because this team, just what else are you going to say at this point? They've been a bummer. They have not lived up to the standard in league play. In a lot of ways, I feel like they've regressed. Some of that probably has to do with the scouting in the league being strong. There's no secrets in Mountain West play. A lot of these guys, these coaches have been around for a while, so they know exactly what CSU is trying to accomplish offensively. And I think you feel that with this team this year. It's not like they jack up awful shots, or it's just that when things get bogged down and when the defense is able to have some success, it just feels like the Rams can create very little out of structure. They don't have anybody who's going to put their head down and attack the hoop outside of really Jevin Mooney's is about the only guy on the team that'll do it with any type of consistency. I would put him back in the starting lineup, by the way. I think you have to take Pasquarelli's role and reduce it at this point. He's improved defensively, but not so much so that they can afford to have him go 0 for 8 and shooting the ball as poorly as he has in league play. I mean, he's out there to score. And if he's not doing that, again, like he's not the highest level defender. He's improved. I think he's improved, and a lot of these guys on the defensive side have improved as the season has gone on. The problem is it's either we hit this open three that we're able to create, and they do a good job of creating open threes. But if they can't hit them, a lot of the time this team panics. And the Rams, being 4 of 23 from 3-point, that's the difference in the game. Wyoming going 12 of 25 from 3-point, CSU 4 of 23. That's the game right there. You didn't have the same turnover struggles that you had in the couple of games, and that was encouraging, I suppose. Although Wyoming defensively is not very stout. They just lack the ability to create good shots out of structure. And maybe part of that was me being spoiled, having gotten to watch, a half decade straight of Roddy to Stevens to Nique, Clifford. Like those are all NBA guys. They're going to skew, what you think is possible. And that's probably true. Some of these guys, we probably just had too high of expectations based on what we had seen in recent years. And CSU was just really lucky that they had a really strong stretch of NBA guys coming through the program. But it's tough in a game like this Wyoming one where you're just bricking open look after open look. And, there's really not much else you can do. Like, again, credit Jev. I thought he did a good job of at least giving CSU a fighting chance. And I would bring him back in the starting lineup as your starting point guard. I think Rex better suited to be off ball anyways. And then, who knows, maybe Pasquarelli can provide a spark for you off the bench. But if not, at least he's not out there for 30 minutes a game. They've got to figure something else out because 1 and 5 over the last 6. They don't get to the free throw line. Only once in that stretch did they get to the free throw line for 15 plus attempts. Guess what? It's the one game they won. And some of that stems from Air Force playing bad defense and hacking the Rams a little bit. They're just not a good team. So it makes sense that you got more free throw attempts in that game. But I also think that some of it is on CSU not forcing the issue. And again, not really having anybody who can, like, you want to know, I'm going to get to my spot or I'm going to get to the line. And maybe you got to play Augie more. Like he's somebody who can play with his back to the hoop and draws a lot of contact. I feel like we've seen some decent stretches from him despite the lack of success of late. But, what type of fight does this team show down the stretch? We'll see. Because on paper, there's a lot of favorable games. You got Fresno at home. You got multiple games against San Jose State. You got another game against Wyoming, who's not good, despite the fact that they thoroughly outplayed you in this one. You have an opportunity to at least give yourself a respectable record in league play. You also have an opportunity for things to really kind of compound here and spiral out of control. And that would be a big disappointment because the more you underperform, the harder of a sell it becomes, that you made the right decision. And I've made it very clear at this point. I firmly believe Ali Farokhmanesh promoting from within was the best option that CSU had. I think he's going to be a really good head coach. I do. But we've seen some of that inexperience come into play at times. I still think they struggle with the rotation. I still think he struggles on when to call a timeout. I think we felt that in the Wyoming game. You pull within 4, I think, at one point, and then, Wyoming goes on like a quick 12-0 run, when to be able to just take a breath and regroup. I think they kind of struggle with that at times. We've seen them be gun shy, but I also think there were other times where they called them too early in the season. So I understand, second guessing yourself in that regard, but they've got to show some fight here down the stretch, or it's going to be a pretty miserable final month. I will say, I think you're now in a position where it's both about trying to remain competitive, but also focus a little bit on development. If you're going to be a contender next year, that's going to be dependent on people like Kerry Booth, assuming they stick around, Jace Butler, Brandon Rechsteiner making a big leap. Out of everybody on the roster, those are the 3 I would prioritize the most to try and retain and build around. Ideally, you'd hang on to everybody that you want. You're probably not going to. That's just the nature of the beast in 2026. But this team has certainly been pretty underwhelming in league play, and I don't know. I think they're definitely going to have to go out and find a point guard unless we see all of a sudden just this massive leap from JoJo that we haven't really seen to this point. So I think he has a bright future too, and I get like why you want to get him experience, but I also wonder if it's been at the detriment of CSU's competitiveness at times. Just feels like he's not ready to handle the ball against D1 defenses, but maybe he makes a leap down the second half of the stretch. I don't know. I just want to see the Rams show some backbone here. They've got to be able to get downhill more, and it just has been lacking. I agree with the Toyota chat here. Significantly, they lack a facilitator. They lack wings that are able to attack the rim. You need to see more of it. The last thing I will say is you've seen some commentary from Sundance Wicks about there being some hesitancy, I think, from CSU to just overtly agree to we're going to play every year for the next 10 years. I get that to an extent. I do think that CSU and Wyoming should continue to play in basketball. I think the Rams should continue to go to Laramie. I do think that there are some parameters that come with that. I don't think you just keep it as a strict home and home. For instance, if Wyoming's not investing in hoops, if it's going to be a landmine for your metrics, that changes the conversation. But I think in the spirit of what's good for college sports, yes, I want more regional rivalries. I want teams to continue to play. And I do think that, testing yourself in an environment like Laramie, although it's a hard place to play, you've got some options for some pretty quality road games without having to break the bank. And I think that's a win if you're a CSU, to have teams like New Mexico and Wyoming, who you were in a league with forever, that are going to be a quality game for you without having to go across the country. Like, you need as many of those as you can get. It's hard to schedule quality games when you're a quality mid-major program. So I want to continue to play Wyoming. Maybe it becomes a 2-for-1 type ordeal depending on where Wyoming's at metrics-wise. But I do hope to continue to play on a yearly basis, and I even hope to continue to go to Laramie because, I always point out how much do we hate when CU tries to act like they're too big for their britches, or, we can't play you, or, you have to come here. We're not coming there. Like, it's just not what competing is supposed to be about. It's not what rivalries are supposed to be about. Player rivals continue to do so. So I'm going to end it on that. Shout out to everybody that was rocking with us. We'll be going live again Friday at 11. Thank you for listening to the DNVR Rams podcast presented by Branded Bills. Head to brandedbills.com. Use that code BBDNVR for 15% off your first order. Much love, y'all. Always proud to be. Peace.
We all silly like the mayor.